Welcome back, everybody, to the next episode of How to Get Away with Staffing. My name's Colin LeBeau, president here at Foxhire. We've got two amazing people from my team, Jamie Henry, our director of operations and healthcare services, and Jessica Arby, our director of HR. Hey guys, how are you?
Hey,
Doing
Colin.
well,
Good.
thanks.
Good. I'm excited to talk to you guys today. It's a very interesting topic we're going to talk about, which is staffing in Illinois, what you need to know about it. Illinois is a fun place. They are giving California a run for their money for being the most difficult place to employ people in America. So I'm going to walk through a number of reasons why that is, sort of talk about the concepts that impact staffing. But I guess the first question is like, where is this all coming from? Jess, maybe this is a great start for you. Like, what's new in Illinois that's making it so much more difficult?
Yeah, there's the Illinois Temporary and Day Labor Services Act. So
Yeah.
that has been around for a while, but they've made some changes recently. It kind of started to put it back top of mind for anyone that's in the staffing space. Um, it's it makes it really hard to do staffing in Illinois, especially if your niche is blue collar workers. There
Right.
is exemption from that act if you are doing roles that are professional or clerical in nature. But when you're dipping into the blue collar type of roles, this is when that act is really important that you make sure you're following it. So some of the things that you would need to be aware of whenever you're employing people in those kinds of industries in Illinois. There is a requirement for equal pay and benefits compared to the workers that are at the work site working
Oh,
directly
right.
for the employer. If your staff employee has worked there for um, 720 hours, that's when they hit that threshold of you need to make sure as the staffing agency that you're paying them, an equal or fair pay that's similar to the same role or similar role at the work site. Same with benefits and things like that. So if the benefits that you're offering are not as rich as what the end client host employer are offering, that could be problematic. So just being
Right.
aware of that.
And
Um,
720 hours is about 4.5 months, right? So like
if it was full time, yeah.
if it was full time. So if they work there full time for 4.5 months,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to have to either make sure they have the right benefits to stay on working that assignment,
Yep.
or you're going to, as a staffing firm, you're going to hope for a conversion fee because most staffing firms, especially blue collar, don't offer strong benefits packages, right? Like they're
Yeah.
offering MEC MVP type packages, check the box. Those
Hmm.
will not match most clients, especially big companies. Like if you're staffing a big manufacturing project, that's probably going to be at a place like Amazon or a big manufacturing company, or places that have large populations of employees, which means they have a benefits plan. So
Right.
not only do you have to match them, you've got to figure out what those plans are. Like just getting that information from your client could prove difficult, especially if there's an
Yes.
MSP or VMS in the middle. Very hard.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'll add to one thing that we maybe should have touched on first. There's a step before you even get to that part is making sure that you're registered. So as a staffing agency, you want to make sure that you know the ins and outs of how to be registered under that Temp Day Labor Services Act. There's fees involved, there's a lot of paperwork involved, and
Yep.
there are requirements on maintaining that.
You have to renew
So
annually, right, Jess? Is that it's an
yeah,
annual renewal? Yeah.
that's right.
And there's reporting involved. So like you have to
Right.
communicate with them on a consistent basis about the business and
Hmm.
who you're hiring and all of those types of things.
Right.
So even that reporting can be pretty burdensome.
Hmm.
Yeah. And it typically has to be done through their portal as well. So it'll be done through the
State of Illinois.
DOL. Yep, through their portal too. So you have to make sure you're registered well in advance so that you have access to supply all that information when it's due.
Got it.
Right.
Yeah, so lots of stuff. If you're going to do staffing in Illinois, I would urge you to read the Illinois Day and Temporary Labor Services Act that just recently changed. So over the past few months, there have been numerous amendments to that act as well. So it first came out, I think, in the summertime, and then it was amended a couple of times thereafter. So the most recent one, I would urge you to find that online to make sure that you at least understand your responsibilities if you're going to be placing in Illinois.
Right.
So
Yep.
that's just the baseline. That's just the baseline, right? Then you think about like regional differences, right? So we know that Chicago is probably the biggest city in the Midwest, nevertheless, Illinois, and the majority of staffing opportunities are probably near the Chicago area. So how does Chicago differ from the rest of the state?
Well, as far as the temp Day Labor Services Act, it should be pretty much the same, but there are other things. So like other areas that are affected are like the mandated paid time off and mandated sick time. So that's like a newer thing that was added in 2024 is that they require that employers that are employing people that do the work in Chicago, that you're also giving them additional paid time off that they can be used for however they want to use it. So it's not necessarily just for sick time. And that can be challenging if, if it's not something that you're used to or even know about, just being aware that that exists and you have to comply with it. It's mandated by the city. So,
And clients don't always want to pay for sick time or PTO.
Right.
So you've really got to factor that into your bill rate when you're thinking about these states and cities where PTO or sick time is mandated. How are you going to recoup those costs? Because they could eat into a lot of your margin if you're in a low margin business like blue collar work. You may not have had to factor that in previously.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, and another area that we've seen some of our agencies caught off guard, excuse me, is when they have a remote employee. So if that remote employee happens to be working within Chicago,
Right.
you are still required to abide by that ordinance. And we have definitely seen some agencies caught off guard. They've already had a negotiated bill rate, and then they find out that this exists. And it's actually a pretty rich plan too. It's 1 hour
Mm-hmm.
for every 35 hours worked of
Yeah.
both sick time and PTO. So really 2 hours for every 35 hours worked.
Yeah, because they separate those sick time
Yeah.
and PTOs, right? So there's
That's right.
2 hours for every 35
For every
work.
35. That's right.
That is really, really strong compared to most other state mandated PTO plans.
I believe it's by far the
Gotta
strongest,
be the
right,
best.
Jess?
Yeah, gotta be the
Oh
Yeah.
yeah. It's double what every other mandated one is pretty
So your
much.
costs, if you're thinking about it as a recruiting agency, your cost doubled basically because of
Yeah.
that, essentially. Got to
Yeah.
figure out a way to put that in the bill rate or communicate that to your client. Very, very important.
One more thing to point out with that too, Colin, because part of that is PTO, paid time off. You also have to pay out any unused time to that employee upon separation because paid time off is typically viewed as wages. So,
Mhm.
a lot of times that sick time, we're used to not necessarily having to pay that out when an assignment ends. But as far as the PTO goes, the employee is entitled to that, even if they haven't used it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. So can you get that billed to your client? You'd hope so. Because if not, that's quite a bit of payroll if they work for a whole year, as an example.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'd say another part of that is just making sure that the software that you work with is something that can accommodate things like that. So not all software, that handles payroll and timekeeping can handle, the 2 buckets scenario or, those different types of things where the employee can alternate between it's a sick day or it's a, PTO day or whatever. So that's
Yeah,
important.
that's a really good point. You're right, because you have to
Timesheets
track
feed
it separate
invoicing.
too. Yeah.
Timesheets feed invoicing, timesheets feed payroll. So
Yep.
if you don't get it right, it can cause very bad downstream effects. A couple other things you need to get right in Illinois. And a good example, I think, would be like sexual harassment training requirements. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so with the state of Illinois, there is a state-specific requirement for sexual harassment training for all employees, and then there's additional separate training for all manager level employees. So everyone in the state of Illinois, if you're employed, you should have that kind of training, and employers should be monitoring and ensuring that it's handled on a periodic basis. If it requires an annual renewal, if you're doing long-term staffing, it's something that you need to monitor for. Additionally, another regional difference with Chicago is that they have actual bystander intervention training that goes along with that. So they actually need 2 different courses for every employee in Chicago. So they need sexual harassment, but they also need bystander on top of it. Ends up being a couple hours worth of training. So it's something to make sure you're aware of and monitor for and maintain for those employees in Chicago and the whole state of Illinois.
Yep. So if you're thinking about setting up your back office for Illinois or Chicago as a staffing agency, you've got to think about things like, how am I going to get them the proper training courses before they get started, safety or sexual harassment or otherwise?
Mhm.
How am I going to make sure I get application receipts out to them? How am I going to get the information from my client around equal pay and benefits, right? There's like all of these things that you've got to really make sure you're on top of. It's not just like, hey, client, who do you need? And start feeding resumes. Like
Right.
that is the easiest part probably of this process. So that's just normal staffing, normal, just, either clerical or blue collar office-based roles. Then we get into some of the like more highly regulated positions, like education as an example. And Illinois has a very unique law in the education space that makes it pretty cumbersome to do business there. So could you guys talk about that piece?
Yeah, so you're talking about Faith's Law. So
It's
for
law, correct.
anyone in the education space, whether they're a teacher or even non-teachers, anyone in the educational system in the state of Illinois must go through a Faith's Law check. So it's not part of a regular background check. It's like its own separate thing. And basically what the employers are doing is, looking into the history, the work history of every worker that's going to be employed at the schools? And are there any concerns for history of any kind of, sexual abuse or investigations that that employee has been under? Anything that involves a student historically with that person, whether there was an investigation and no findings, whatever it could or could not be. It may not result in like criminal charges, but if there was something historically that happened with John Doe at school ABC,
Right.
that should be on the record in this way. So it's not something there's a database that you can go look at. So you have to actually be communicating with all of the schools that they have worked with historically. So the first part is collecting that information from the candidate, when they're coming on as a new hire, that you're having them identify all those schools that they've worked at previously. And then you, as the employer, are reaching out to all those schools to find out, what is the information on this worker. And then, just tracking all that ultimately so that you can respond
A
later when
lot.
they go move to another school. You're responsible then to reply to the next school and, give them the information that you have. So yeah, there's a lot of data and, keeping of records when you're going through that for sure.
Yeah, and I think that's the thought behind that is great. I think that like it's
For sure.
important that people are protected, but also as you think about this from a staffing firm, like imagine your candidates worked at 4 or 5 schools.
Mhm.
It's a lot of chasing down information.
Mhm.
And at the moment, there's not very many vendors that can even do that, right? Like there's
Right.
just maybe 1 or 2 that know even how to comply with Faith's Law. So a lot of that could just be manual, going and getting stuff, emailing old schools. And the old schools, yes, they're responsible for responding to you, but like they're not incentivized to meet your deadline to get this placement made. Like
Right.
that's not part of their MO. So therefore, like you got to really be in advance on that stuff if you're trying to place educational people in the state of Illinois, or else you could get delayed start dates and no starts because you just didn't get the information on time.
Mhm.
Which is tough.
Yeah.
So, and I think similarly, we see this in the healthcare space because there are specific licenses necessary to place workers in Illinois that work in healthcare settings. Can you talk a little bit about that, Jamie?
Yeah, I mean, I think Illinois was kind of on the forefront of putting the state agency licensure in place, right? So we've seen this now across a number of states, but Illinois was by far one of the first, and they have some of the strictest requirements. They really have a goal of protecting the public, and that's kind of how the license is designed. So they even go to the extent of, in order to be licensed as a nurse agency, so that state calls it a nurse agency license. In order to be licensed as a nurse agency, you have to have a nurse licensed in the state of Illinois on staff. And that application or that license is directly tied to that nurse as well. So that nurse's license is inextricable from the agency license. And they've set a lot of like detailed requirements for being able to hire those employees. And it does get into like in-depth reference checks that actually like examine the applicant's clinical abilities. And you have to conduct a skills checklist that shows they're a fit for the requirements of the role. So it can't just be a general skills checklist. It's expected to be role specific.
Yep.
So that's a big burden for an agency to carry. This means you have to have a pretty big library of skills checklists, or you have to be willing to, pay for an outside service that has that library.
Sure.
They also want a physical for every nurse that is placed. And this license specifically governs the placements of RNs, LPNs, and CNAs. So they have to have a physical and a TB test with no more than 1 year prior to their start date, and then repeated annually. You also have to have very specific language in your contracts. So they're very strict when it comes to, non-competes. There's absolutely no non-compete permitted in the employee contract. And in the client contract, you have to go so far as to list the specific bill rates by position. So, if you're placing a director of nursing, you have to have a set bill rate range that is expected for that position. And obviously that would be distinctly different than what you might have for your CNA. And that has to be visible in the contract signed by the client and presented to the state within 5 days of the start date. So lots of like rigor there. And this is another place where Illinois is having you use their portal. So you're not just emailing, you got to make sure somebody's got login access and can get in and submit that. They also want to see proof of orientation. So, they want to make sure that the employee is being appropriately trained and protected as well, which is good. As agencies, we should want to see that. We want to see that our employees are being treated well. And then they have a
don't
lot
always
of
like to pay for orientation, though.
No, that's fair. That's actually a really good point. They don't, and oftentimes they kind of want to dispute whose job the orientation is, right? So it's really getting to the point of like nailing down what are the client-specific requirements for orientation versus the agencies, and making sure that both of those are documented. And then there's quarterly reporting for Illinois as well. And in addition to the quarterly reporting, I will say they have been the most rigorous with their auditing. So we see very routine audits from the state of Illinois, looking at, records and making sure the contracts are as they should be stated, et cetera. So
Jamie and her team get those audit requests for us.
We do.
We are licensed in Illinois, so we know
Yeah.
how this goes. And it's not always fun, but it is important to know about if you're going to be placing in Illinois, because these licenses are generally new. And so therefore, the enforcement of these licenses hasn't become very pervasive. I think Illinois is doing the strongest job at
I would agree.
enforcing the licenses right now. But as they get stronger, they get more familiar with this process that they've created, and they become able to identify non-compliance, they will enforce them. And so if you're a staffing firm in Illinois and you're like, oh, I don't need to get licensed, or you work with an EOR that's not licensed, there will come a day when the license will be enforced, and that will not be good for those who are unlicensed. More and more that's going to happen as this becomes more mature. So it's important to know how to make this possible and get ahead of it before their leniency expires.
Very well stated. Yes.
Yeah. It's very important to do that. So I think we're ahead of the curve. I think there's many staffing firms out there that are doing the right thing, getting ahead of the curve on the compliance piece, but there are many that are not. And if you are feeling like you might be one of them based on lack of information or based off of, inability to execute some of these tasks, I would urge you to find a partner that can help with that. Because it is also a growth opportunity, right? So
absolutely.
The MSPs, right?
Well, and we're hearing from a lot of agencies that used to have a lot of business in Illinois that have pulled back, either because they can't meet the requirements, right? That registered nurse on staff is a big one for a lot of these agencies, or they simply don't want to put the power in, that you need into remaining compliant. They want to find a partner to do it instead. Or they've backed out of the state altogether, which means if you can meet those requirements, there's more business available.
Agreed. Yeah. So it's a growth opportunity for you if you can execute, right? And you can find partners to help you execute that. Obviously, we're not the only one. Certain other ones out there that you can certainly find. to support you. But if you can do that, it opens up a lot of doors with MSPs, opens up a lot of doors with clients. And with those people backing out of Illinois, there's a great opportunity to execute. We saw similar things in Minnesota and other states where things got very difficult. So if you're looking to build a healthcare staffing firm in Illinois, it's actually a great place to do it if you do it right, because you'll have much more opportunity.
Mhm.
But yeah, Illinois, fun place to do business. I would say this is probably the second most difficult place to do business in the US outside of California. California still got them by a little bit, but there's also a lot of business in Illinois as well. There's a lot of staffing business done in the state of Illinois. So
Mhm.
it's a catch-22. It's a catch-22 for our staffing friends out there. So if you found this valuable, definitely follow us. Give us a like on the video. Would love to help anybody who is interested in staffing in Illinois. So please reach out. Otherwise, we'll catch you next time on the next episode of How to Get Away with Staffing. Thanks, everybody.